Come on, kid. Not gonna let an old man outstrap you, are you? I armed sweat off my forehead as I tried to keep up, Grandpa cackling as he looked back at me. The leaves were in full color in Appalachia, and Grandpa had roused me early that morning for a hike. I would have liked a little more sleep, but I hadn't minded. It had been getting colder lately, the winds becoming crisp as the season crept closer to winter. There wouldn't be many more opportunities for a hike this season, and I didn't really have anything else to occupy my day. I pulled in a lungful of air as I walked, enjoying the day as we took in the beauty around us. The birds fluttered overhead, many of them preparing for their trip to warmer climates. The squirrels gabbled as they played amongst the boughs, their nests ready for the coming cold as they gathered food. Soon, Granddad and I would pick up our treats for the kiddos who came by the flea market booth and prepare to put out the Christmas decorations again. It seemed that the year had flown by before my eyes, and I wondered what awaited me in the years to come. Watching Grandpa amble over the familiar paths, I wondered how many more walks like this we would have as well. Grandpa had disappeared over a low rise, and I sped up to catch him. That was when I noticed the weird collection of bones hanging in a nearby tree. The circle of bones was arranged in an oddly mystic pattern, with the outer ring made of thicker, larger bones, and the inner symbols made of small, delicate ones. It was hanging by something that looked like a frayed rope, but I sort of thought might actually be hair. I didn't recognize the configuration, but the edges led me to believe it was something not of the light. The protective wards Grandpa usually arranged were made of smooth geometry and clean angles. This pattern looked like it might be a warning, though. It looked like those no trespassing signs at the edge of someone's property, surrounded by a chain-link fence. The longer I stared at the pattern, the more I felt myself begin to shake. My fists were balled up at my side, and I was filled with a sense of dread. What was going on? I'd never felt like this. Not since I was a child, faced with something I couldn't understand. Had Grandpa made this and left it for me? When had he had the time? I reached out to touch it before I could even think about it, and as my fingers slid over the bony surface, I heard Grandpa call out a warning a second before the thing just fell to pieces. "Don't!" he yelled, knocking my hand away, but it was too late. "Grandpa, are you okay?" I asked, shaking a little as I looked down at him. He looked like he had come on the run, and he was ragged and gaspy. "No, son. No, I'm not. This is bad, boy. He's too close to the house. Too close by far. We gotta get out of here. We gotta get to the house. We can't. We need to." Grandpa seemed to get lost as his plans came together. It was the most frantic I'd ever seen him, and it frankly scared the hell out of me. "Who are you talking about, Grandpa? Didn't you make this?" Before Grandpa could say a word, I heard a sound like the gates of hell opening up, and all the souls of the underworld spilling out. "Damn it, boy!" Grandpa yelled, grabbing my arm and setting off at a sprint. "Run! Run! Run!" We ran, the woods around us no longer bustling with the activity they had before. The birds and squirrels had all hidden their faces, and even the low drone of the bugs had gone away. That scream started getting closer as we ran, and it sounded huge. It was like a monstrous bear or a charging elephant, and I could see the tops of the trees shaking as whatever it was slammed its way towards us. I'd always marveled at Grandpa's speed, but today it was like trying to keep up with a hummingbird. No roots or holes got in his way, and he had his eyes forward and his feet on the trail. "The river, boy! The river! We need to cross the river! It can't follow us if we get over the water!" I was already out of breath, but I buried it as the thing shook the ground with its lumbering steps. Birds took flight behind us as whatever it was slammed into the trees. Its roar split the air again, and I put on an extra burst of speed to catch up with Grandpa. I didn't think he would leave me behind, but I wasn't completely sure either. I'd never seen him this angry, not even when I'd broken the bottle tree, and that anger was twinged with fear. Grandpa didn't run for much, and watching him in full flight told me all I needed to know. Whatever this was, it was too big for Grandpa, and that was terrifying. We had crossed the river about 30 minutes before, but our frantic pace brought us close to it far sooner than expected. We had been ambling, taking in the sights, and our hike had been more of a stroll. As it stretched out before us, Grandpa prepared to jump. He clearly meant to splash into the stony creek bed and keep running, but I felt sure that he might just leap over it. We had called it a river, but that might be too grand a term. It was hardly a creek, the banks about 8 feet wide on either side, and the water wasn't exactly raging. It hadn't rained in a few months, and the snow melt that added to the creek had it barely more than a foot deep. The two of us had stopped for a drink when we'd crossed, and I could recall that crisp taste as my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. When the edge of the creek gave way under me, sending me spilling into the foot of cold water, I groaned as the rocks dug into my hands and buttocks. "Come on, boy!" Grandpa yelled, flapping his hands frantically. "Get across, quick!" I got splashily to my feet and started running. Whatever was behind me came thundering towards the bank, and I could feel the river trying to drag my feet under. Unlike Grandpa, my foot seemed to sink into every hidden crevice, and I expected the thing would jump on me any minute. Grandpa's eyes got wide as he stared at what had come lumbering out of the woods behind me, and I put on an extra burst of speed as I churned up the water. When I flopped onto the bank at Grandpa's feet, I felt the stitch in my side grip painful fingers into my ribs. I was shocked I had made it at all, and when I looked up at Grandpa, he was shaking in his hiking boots. I rolled over, wanting to see what had him so spooked, but my curiosity was far from rewarded. As I gulped in frantic lungfuls of air, I caught sight of something large and white as it ran back into the forest, and the image filled me with fear. I didn't get a good look, but I could see a white horse skull as it glared at me atop the pearly mass of moving parts. It rushed back into the woods too quickly for me to see, but I could still feel those dark pits as they bore into me. What was that?" I breathed out, lungs still trying to process oxygen as I gasped. Grandpa was quiet for some time, and I didn't think he was going to answer me there for a second. Then he half whispered, "Bone collector," and the way he said it sent a shudder through me. "And what is a bone collector?" I asked, sitting up as I tried to control my breathing, getting back to my feet as I looked off in the direction it had gone. "Something I thought I had dealt with a long time ago, kiddo. Come on. Looks like we're going to be busy for the next couple of days." As he helped me up, I glanced back to the other side of the river to see if it had come back. It seemed that whatever instinct had brought it to us would not let it cross the river, and we were safe for the time being. How long we would stay safe remained to be seen, and as Grandpa started making his way back through the forest, I followed close behind him. So why didn't it come across the river after us? "It can't. The bone collector is a beast that follows the ways of old magic. It can't cross running water, or its form will be broken up. You can bet that it's looking for a place to get around and get after us again, though. So let's get the hell home." Despite our earlier flight, Grandpa had apparently been holding back. He was like a little gray squirrel as he made his way through the woods, and if he hadn't had a hold of my hand, I would have likely been left behind. I could hear something out in the woods every now and again, a faint sound like trees being pushed over, and the loosing of that terrible cry. It scared me more than anything ever had. Had that creature just been in the woods this whole time? We had walked this same trail again and again. How would we never encountered this thing? "So, what is the bone collector?" I asked, ducking a branch that Grandpa had let go of a little too soon. "A mistake, but I guess it's something they felt they had to do," Grandpa half said. "Who?" I asked, trying to keep up. "I'm sure you know that our ancestors haven't always been the best house guests, kiddo. We rolled into the Appalachian countryside like a wrecking ball and slowly pushed the native people out. They were patient with us, but we made it pretty clear that we did not return their patience. There was once a town nearby called Calic. It was close to a major river, close to the woods, and the logging trade had sprung up there easily. When it came time to build the city, the settlers thought that the big open plot of land near the lumber camp was perfect for settling on. The natives, however, disagreed. They disagreed so strongly that they went to talk to the city elders about it several times before buildings began to be placed on the site. This was a sacred place. Their relatives were buried there, and building anything there would upset the spirits buried there. They couldn't just let the settlers build on the site and disrupt the spirits of their ancestors, so they attacked the site twice, burned it down once, and occupied the site until the Georgia militia came down on them in force. He froze suddenly, holding up a hand and listening. I stood still, cocking my head as I tried to hear what he was hearing, but I guess I failed miserably. Grandpa liked to joke that he could hear a squirrel curse in the next grove over, but it was spooky what he could pick up in the woods sometimes. We stood there for a count of 60, and as the sounds of playing squirrels and chattering birds became background music, I finally heard what he was hearing. It was faint, but that crashing and roaring was no longer behind us. Now it was to the southeast, and coming towards true east. "We've got a little time, but not much," Grandpa hissed, pulling me along behind him. As we ran, he told me the rest of the story. They had killed the invaders, but it was more than that. They had spilled blood upon blood, and the spirits in those mounds were angry. They attached themselves to the bones buried there, taking the bones of animals and the recently deceased as they warped them into something terrible. The militia never returned, and when they sent another unit to see what had happened, they found the bodies of the first, minus all their bones, of course. I'd read the reports from people who saw the site, and they said the ground was churned up, the bodies still present, nothing but pulped and rotten meat. From that day on, people reported being stalked by a huge forest creature. Rumors of the creature were talked about until just before the Civil War, when a local preacher went into the woods and was supposed to have put it to rest. No one knew how, and no one much cared, really. They were just glad to feel safe in the woods again. Oh, it came back from time to time, needing to be put to rest again, but it was laid in the ground anew each time, and it went pretty well until it was... He trailed off then, looking away as we came to the edge of the property. As we came to the borders of Grandpa's home, he touched one of the trees, and I saw something on the bark sparkle a little. He had set one of the wards he often used into the sturdy oak, and when the sun hit it, I saw the energy crackle inside it. Grandpa's wards always gave out a little push, protecting people by making them feel braver, or warding them by making them seem repulsive to the creatures best avoided. But Grandpa was not some pointy hat-wearing wizard. His wards were more like a suggestion than outright magic, and Grandpa said that's why they worked so well. People couldn't mistrust or outright despise something that applied the feelings they or the creatures already possessed. Case in point, the ward was similar to a stone thrown in the opposite direction. Whatever creature tripped the ward would suddenly hear a sound and go to investigate it, instead of walking onto Grandpa's property. "Walk around and touch the wards. We'll meet at the far side of the property when they're all empowered. Hurry up. We don't want this thing to get inside." He set off without another word, and I was left with no choice but to walk in the opposite direction and arm the wards. The wards sparkled when I touched them, but it was getting on afternoon, so it could have just been the setting sun making them twinkle. I understood that some of the practical arts that Grandpa taught me, stuff like herbcraft and woodsmanship, had some basis in science, but the wards and sigils that Grandpa used were something else. They worked because Grandpa believed they worked, and mine worked because I'd seen Grandpa's work. That being said, I had no clue how they functioned. As I touched them, I knew it was just something I had to believe in, whether or not I understood it. I met Grandpa about 20 minutes later, and he nodded after glancing around. "That's all of them. Let's hope it's enough to keep it occupied while I'm getting things ready to put it to sleep again." I nodded, kind of expecting that. "So you were the one that put it to rest last time." Grandpa didn't say anything, though. I expected this to be a setup for yet another Grandpa story. He would tell me about his battle with the bone collector, and I would sit on the porch at dusk and take it all in as a beer sweated in my hand. It was how we had spent most nights since I came to live with him. Grandpa spinning tales and me soaking them in. Tonight, though, seemed like it might be different. Grandpa mounted the stairs on the porch instead, stopping at the top as he realized the silence had gone on too long. Go get the red and the blue herbs from the shed, along with all my mason jars. I'll go get my exorcism kit as well.
I fear you may need more than your tricks this time, Fisher.
Grandpa jumped, and I whirled to see Glimmer coming out of the woods, her long silver hair still hanging in that intricate braid she wore. Her purple eyes were mischievous, but I could also see something like fear behind her cheeky smile. She had a bow slung over one shoulder, and a knife in a sheath on the other. She came up to me, tossing her hair before planting a kiss on my cheek, and turning back to Grandpa.
The bone collector is madder than I have ever seen it, and with very good reason. One of your kind has dug up his resting place and filled it with his garbage.
The three of us sat on the back porch, Grandma and Glimmer seeming to hear every muffled crash from the woods. I could hear them too, and whatever it was sounded like a rhinoceros blundering around out there. I couldn't hear much, not nearly as much as they could, but the fact that I could hear anything was alarming. If I could hear this creature, then it was much closer than I thought. Glimmer sniffed at the bottle we had offered her and wrinkled her nose. Grandpa was drinking from his, but it was mechanical. He wasn't enjoying it, wasn't in his element as he normally was when we sat out on the porch at night. I took a sip of my own, enjoying the seasonal ale as much as I could, as Glimmer filled us in on what had happened. Are you telling me that this all started because the city council decided to break ground on a new dump?
Your town has decided that the old dump wasn't good enough anymore and, in their infinite wisdom, decided to clear out an old gravel pit so it could dump its trash there.
Grandpa rolled his eyes and let the bottle sweat against his hand. That sounds like our mayor. Anything to keep the rabble happy. Who cares if a few hundred of his constituents get hollowed out of the damn bone collector, so long as those left behind have a place to put their trash.
Indeed, the further of you humans is quite impressive sometimes. What do you intend to do about this bone collector, Fisher?
What else? Seal it up again until someone inevitably frees it. Why not just seal it up somewhere where no one's going to find it again? I asked, thinking of a spot, but knowing that Grandpa wouldn't like it. Glimmer and Grandpa looked at me for a moment before Glimmer fixed her pointy teeth into a wide smile.
I see he got more than your looks, Fisher. Where would you suggest?
I looked at Grandpa, and he seemed to understand what I was thinking. We could lure him to the stream where you cleansed me after the bottle tree. If we seal him in there, the water will keep him from coming back, won't it? I asked, suddenly unsure. Grandpa scratched his chin, looking unsure, but finally nodding. Yeah, that might work. That's a long trip with that thing after us, though. I'm not sure we could outrun it for that long.
Leave that to me. This bone creature is nothing. I will let him on a merry chase and give you 2 the time you need to set up.
There will certainly be a lot of setup, too, Grandpa said, looking away into the woods. The three of us sat there for quite some time, talking about what to do and making our plans. It was decided that we would draw the bone collector into the stream. We would seal him into the clay there, after Grandpa had properly blessed it, of course. Then it would lay trapped there until some logger or developer made their way that deep into the woods to disturb it. Grandpa hoped he'd be long dead once that happened. Personally, I prayed it would be even longer than that.
And you can stop him this time?
Grandpa nodded, but I didn't like the way she had asked it. She sounded as if she were asking if he were capable, perhaps thinking Grandpa was too old. To my surprise, however, Grandpa looked a little scared. Not scared of the creature, and not scared that he might fail. He seemed scared that Glimmer would reveal something he'd rather stay hidden. I'll be fine, he said tersely, cutting her off and leaving no question that the subject was closed. These old bones are more than capable of putting something like him to rest. He got up then, deciding to take his old bones to bed, as he excused himself. He left his beer in the cup holder, the only one I'd ever seen him leave unbroken. The sight of that bottle unnerved me, and I think Glimmer recognized it too. She watched him go sadly, almost seeming to want to go after him.
I never meant to shame him. I simply wanted to be sure that he was capable this time.
What do you mean by that? Grandpa's older and wiser than he was in his youth. It should be even easier for him to conquer the bone collector than it was the first time.
That might be true, but your grandfather didn't conquer the bone collector when they first met.
It was the last thing I had expected her to say. Wait, no. Granddad said that he was the one that sealed the bone collector away last time. Glimmer sat back in her chair, sprawling like a cat, as she contemplated her next words. I hadn't known her long, but she really didn't seem the type to mince words. Maybe her people were always so forward, but nothing seemed to hold her back. To see her unsure was a little scary.
Has Fisher truly never told you about his first encounter with the bone collector? He tells you everything else. I wonder why this is something he won't talk about.
It's not the only thing, I admitted, looking away as a bat clicked overhead. I know now that Grandpa has secrets. Before this year, I never knew much about him, really. Certainly nothing about this secret world he belongs to. It's funny, but I feel like I know him better now than I have at any other point in my life. Even so, I know there are things he won't talk about, can't talk about, and that's okay. One day he'll trust me enough to talk about them, I suppose. She laughed, and her laugh surprised me as it cut across the thrum of crickets. I was startled, but not altogether unnerved by it.
I love how serious human gets sometimes. If Fisher didn't tell you, it's probably because he's still ashamed of what happened that night. He needn't be, though. It really wasn't any fault of his. He was little more than a child when he was called to help, and his failure was expected. It was brave of him to try.
I glanced over my shoulder to the dark house, wondering if it was right to ask her. This, like so many other things, was Grandpa's story to tell, and he would tell it in his own time. This story, though, could help me tomorrow if Grandpa and I were going to seal this creature away. I still wasn't sure if I truly believed in all this mystic stuff, but I believed in things I had seen yesterday. If I went against it without knowing what it fully was, Grandpa or I could end up dead. Will you tell me the story, I asked? Can you tell me the story?
I will tell you what I can. I wasn't there. I was just a child myself, but I remember what Fisher told me. Fisher had been spending a lot of time in the woods. He had recently lost his friends and was looking for some way to escape that guilt. He had never left the woods, though, and the years since we'd met on the river bank were full of time spent together. The deaths of his friends at the hands of the strange lights had reignited his interest in the craft his grandmother had been teaching him, and I helped him where I could. He was progressing well, making a name of himself in the region, which was likely what had drawn the town men to seek him out. So, when he came to me one afternoon and asked me if I knew about the bone collector, I was curious to know why. He said that recently, the town's scrapyard had sustained some damage, and something that had been sealed there had escaped. The man had some idea of what had been sealed up in that old churchyard, and he knew that Fisher's grandmother had known even more. He knew she had passed, but that she had taught him her ways, and hoped that maybe she had taught him how to put the creature back to sleep. Fisher had read about the creature and what would need to be done to put it away again, but he thought I might know other things, and hoped those things would help him. I told him what I knew, which wasn't much, and wished him luck when he went to fight it. I told my father about it when I got home, and he thought I would ever see Fisher again. My father knew much of the bone collector, the creature that even we fear, and told me that only a few humans had ever managed to put the collector down again after it had been disturbed. I was worried for Fisher, but all I could do was hope that he would be okay.
I nodded. Grandpa had said something similar. Grandpa could say what he liked, but he was still afraid that he couldn't do it. I was worried that it was because he was so much older now, but maybe it was something else entirely. Maybe he was afraid that he couldn't do it, because he had never accomplished anything like it in his life.
When Fisher came back, I was overjoyed. I had thought I might never see him again. I just knew it that the bone collector had added him to his collection. And When he called me one night just like he always had, I couldn't believe my ears. Fisher, however, had changed. He was quiet. He didn't smile like the boy I had known before, and he said he'd only come to say goodbye. They were telling people to go to war in a foreign place, and he was going to fight. I asked if this had something to do with the battle against the bone collector, but he wouldn't tell me much. He would say that if the snake handler hadn't arrived, he would have been dead for sure. I didn't know who this snake handler was, but I find it unlikely that he'll show up this time if things go badly.
She may not have known who the man was, but I remembered. Grandpa had been saved twice now by this mysterious snake handler. I hoped he wouldn't need him a third time. The old guy would have been well over 100. The two of us sat silently for a while, just listening to the crickets as we put our thoughts together.
I will go. Tomorrow will be a long day, and I will need my rest.
I'll walk you, I said, getting up to follow, but she put a hand on my chest to stop me.
I know the way, handsome. You will need your sleep for tomorrow as well. Go, get some rest. I'll see you tomorrow night.
She turned to go, but when she turned back, I had little chance to do anything but stand there like an idiot. Her lips were rough, her teeth like polished stones as they pressed behind them, and when she pulled back, I wish she hadn't. She smiled at me, impish and whip fast, and then she was off the porch and into the woods like a startled deer. I was powerless to do much more than stand there in shocked delight as the night breathed around me like a crouching animal just before a leap. We set out around 2, hoping to time it so we could arrive just before sunset. Grandpa claimed he wanted to channel the dying day into the ceiling magic. I just nodded, hoping to see what he was talking about. Grandpa had woken me up that morning way earlier than I had wanted. I could see the light was still soft, not the middle of the morning light I was expecting. Grandpa was shaking me frantically, telling me we needed to get ready, and I had tried to wave him off. I had stayed up late, Glimmer's story taking longer than expected, and I'd only managed a few hours of sleep before Grandpa was shaking me. "I'm tired, Grandpa. Let me get a few more hours." "We may not have a few more hours, boy. It's gone for now, but it could be back any time. We need to be gone when it is." I sat up in bed, not having to ask what he meant. "It found the house? Come out to the yard and see for yourself." When I stepped out onto the porch, I saw what he was talking about. The yard glistened with bones, long trails that had been left behind by something big, and more of those angry-looking shapes that were left around the house. They looked different from the ones I had disturbed. They were bristly, agitated, looking more like something you spray paint on the side of someone's house when you want to scare them. There were corpses in the yard, birds and squirrels and small animals of various sizes. They'd been pulped like so much raw fruit and left behind after their bones had been taken. "We've got to get ready. When this thing comes back, I want to be long gone." It was almost 2 by the time we got everything together, and that was when I finally got a good look at it. As we walk through the woods now, I kind of wish I hadn't. I really wish I had seen this thing cold when we did whatever it was we were going to do tonight. I'm not sure I'll still have the nerve with the image of this creature knocking around in my head. However large I had imagined it was didn't do it justice. This creature is far worse than anything I could have imagined, and the thought that it might be, even now, stalking us through the woods makes my skin crawl. We were heading out the front when Grandpa suddenly yanked me back inside. I got a little angry, turning around to ask him what the hell was wrong with him, but he was already pushing me down and telling me to be as quiet as possible. I started to ask what he'd seen, but suddenly the light outside was blocked out. Something moved in front of the big front window on the porch, and I turned to see this giant pale monstrosity as it slithered by. Its torso and head were vaguely equine. Its arms were like an odd combination of spider legs and human hands with too many fingers. It had 4 arms, pulling itself along with great suffering pulls, and its hands ended in what might have been 15 pale white fingers. Its bottom half was more like a walrus, a bulbous end with a wide fin, and I couldn't imagine how it didn't churn up the ground with each struggling yank of that bulbous thing. There was flesh on its bones, some of them at least, and it looked pieced together from too many different bones to make sense of. The mouth and fingers might have been delicate avian bones. The bulk of it might have been bear or horse bones, and its mouth was filled with a collection of too many teeth to make sense of. When it turned its head, I was captured by those sunken black pits of eyes an instant before I could get below the edge of the window. Those eyes had seen me, and I had seen too much in them. Suddenly the house shuddered as it slammed into the front porch, and Grandpa took my arm as he yelled for me to follow him out the back. It sounded like the hell beast was destroying the porch as we came onto the back area, and Grandpa took the back steps 2 at a time as we ran for the woods. The forest canopy was its home, but it suddenly seemed much safer than the false safety of the house. I started to ask Grandpa why his wards didn't keep the creature away, but he shushed me and led me deeper into that sea of green. We had walked for about an hour when he finally answered my question. I assume that the spells only fooled it for so long. It was the equivalent of a distraction, after all, and this creature is older than even I am. I kept listening for something huge following us, but the usual sounds of the forest were all I could hear. That was comforting, since I knew that the forest dwellers didn't like this thing any more than we did. As long as I could hear the sounds of squirrels and birds, all was well. So, why didn't it come and get us in our sleep, I asked, not wanting an answer, but wanting to hear someone talk. Well, the wards on the trees aren't the only bit of misdirection that I have. The house is in a blind. That's what I've always called it, and it sorta stops things like the bone collector from finding us. It helps confuse things like the Weldergeist, too. Otherwise, I would have probably been found out years ago. We crunched through the woods, the sun beginning its low descent as we made our way for the stream. Grandpa seemed to move by intuition, taking paths and trails at random as his natural compass led him towards the stream. The pack I wore was heavy as it cut into my shoulders, and the sweat trickling down my face was beginning to attract gnats. Grandpa never seemed to feel his own pack, and as we walked along, I realized my anxiety might be weighing me down more than the pack. So, Gramps, how are we going to seal this thing? Well, most of the work is going to be done by the stream itself. It's an old stream, a place that's important to people long gone from here. The candles and herbs we have will help strengthen the location, and I think if we can lure it into the mud around the banks, we can trap it. And you're sure about this? I hedged, stepping around the arm of a spruce as I followed behind him. Of course. I've done things like this before. It's a simple sealing spell, nothing more. But that's where I floundered. Why was I pressing him so hard? I had never doubted Grandpa in these matters. I'd always understood that he knew more than I did, and if he said it would be okay, then it would be okay. Glimmer's story wouldn't leave me so easily, though, and I felt ashamed in my doubt as Grandpa kept his eyes ahead. It seemed, though, that the old man could read my mind. Glimmer told you my story. It wasn't a question. Yeah, not all of it, but she told me that you didn't really seal the bone collector last time. Grandpa turned around, but I could see him nod to the woods. She's right. I didn't seal him away. I tried, but I was young and only half-trained. It was an event that led me to grow, but it was definitely one of the scariest times of my life. I followed behind him, waiting for his story to begin and realizing that he would make me ask him to tell it. He was ashamed of the story, ashamed of the lie, and he wouldn't tell it to me unless I asked. I had never had to wheedle a story out of Grandpa before, but it seemed that this one would take some doing. As he walked, the forest buzzing around us with 1,000 voices, I couldn't take it anymore. Will you tell me the story, Grandpa? The only reply was the sound of him crunching along, and I thought for a moment that he wouldn't respond. You sure you want to hear it? I'm not sure it'll help your nerves given what we've got to do tonight. I do, I said, realizing this was the most important story of them all. This was not some cherry-picked Grandpa story. This was not a story that might make Grandpa seem brave or overly competent. This was a raw Grandpa tale, something that he might not have shared with anyone else. He had shared some of it with Glimmer, someone I was beginning to believe he had been more than friends with, but not all. I could very well be the first one to hear this particular skirmish, and I wondered how right Grandpa might be. How might this story change my outlook on tonight's activities? It all began with a man I hadn't seen since Grandma died. They had been friends of a sort, and now he was hoping that he could get some help in sealing away something dangerous. Something that could be very bad for his church and the people in it. The man was Reverend Tucker, and he had a nasty something in the graveyard behind his church. He found me one afternoon as I slumped against the wall of the local rot-gut dispensary. I was drunk as a lord, watching the streetlight as it winked on and off, and thinking again of the lights that had taken my friends. The blinking light reminded me of them, but I was too tanked to do much more than sit and stare. When someone stepped in front of the light, I blinked and looked up into the unforgiving face of Reverend Tucker. By my guess, he was between 40 and 60, and he had that look of someone who will look 40 until he dies. He had lifted me up by the shirt front, drawing me to eye level as he told me how much my grandmother would have been ashamed to see me like this.
She wanted better than this for you, boy. She always doted on you, and it would kill her all over again to see you in such a state.
I pulled away and asked him what the hell he wanted. I hadn't been serious about my lessons in a long while, but that didn't mean I had forgotten them. I continued my studies, reading over Grandma's old books whenever I had the chance. Lately I had found myself with more time than usual since my friends were dead, and I had decided to be ready the next time something came my way. I didn't have Grandma to fall back on anymore, and it would be down to me next time.
We have a problem, and unfortunately you're the only one here that might be able to help me. I need you to sober up and come with me. We'll get you some coffee in the rectory once we get there, but I need your expertise, and I need it to be coherent.
I thought about getting indignant, but there was really no sense arguing with him. He was right, and I felt a deep sense of shame at how I had acted. My grandma would have been ashamed of me if she could see me like this. How many times had she lost more, done worse, and still kept her head? She didn't give up, and neither could I. I would be no sort of man if I did, and as I rubbed my head and apologized to the old holy man, I went with him to see what had taken up residence in his church. Turns out that the graveyard was where my predecessor had sealed the bone collector last time. The old Zion graveyard was part of Zion's Peak Methodist Church, and it was where Reverend Tucker had preached until they had built him a shiny new church closer to town. The house of worship had been experiencing a soft move for the last 2 years, but Tucker had discovered something awful the last time he'd gone to the old church. Something had wrecked the graveyard and drug a furrow through the worship hall.
It was like a tree had fallen through the building and then simply slithered away. I wasn't sure what to make of it, and then I remembered what your grandma told me once. Do you remember when she exorcised that thing out of my house? Well, she told me that I had to keep an eye on Zion Peak because it contained a very dark secret, a secret she had hoped to never face again. That's when she told me that, in her own youth, she had sealed that monster inside the cemetery. It had escaped its old resting place and killed 16 people before she found it. She had tracked it to the cemetery and found it desecrating corpses for their bones. She had sealed it in the old Wainwright crypt, warding the vault and seal so that no one would disturb it and release the horrors that lay below. Well, it turned out the people would be the least of her worries. The spirit was released when a tree fell on the crypt during a windstorm, and now it's running rampant.
The bone collector had killed 13 so far, several of them children, and Reverend Tucker asked me to stop its reign of terror before Others took notice. I tracked it for a week, following its trail of destruction as I prepared to put it back in the ground. When I wasn't tracking it, I was devouring everything I could about the creature, reading over all of Grandma's old journals and notes on the thing, buried below the graveyard. I learned its name and what it was capable of, and the warding spell that would put it back to sleep. I finally managed to track it to an old gravel pit, a recent hotspot for missing persons, and I assembled the things I would need to get the job done. I went to the pit around sunset. Grandma's notes had been clear that a spell cast around the end of the day and the beginning of night would be full of power and might give me the edge I needed to seal the bone collector away. I set up my circle and practiced the chants I would need. I cut my palm and sent out my intent, drawing the creature to me. As the sun set and the darkness began to move across the land, I heard it dragging itself out of one of the deep tunnels in the pit. He was munching on whatever poor miner had been found down there and began to drag itself towards me. I spoke the words, drawing him into the trap I had set for him, and as he passed into the trigger, I prepared to close the teeth on him. I threw out the last of it, spilling all my intent and desire, but when I opened my eyes, I saw it towering over me with a look of bemusement stretched across that bony face. It had felt my warning, heard my intent, and found me wanting. As I stared at the creature, I felt confident that I was about to be its latest victim. We stopped for a moment, Grandpa checking his bearings, and that's when I realized something that the story had stopped me from recognizing. The forest was dead silent around us. The birds and animals, even the bugs, had gone silent, and I could hear the faintest of draggings as something came closer and closer to us. When the trees burst apart and the bone collector loomed over us, I was pretty sure I would never get to hear the end of Grandpa's story. Not unless his bones could talk after the bone collector had finished stripping them down and adding them to his form. As we watched it rear up on its bony, half-formed tail, even Grandpa looked like we might be sunk. It had caught us, just like Grandpa had been afraid of, and now we would never be able to capture it. The bone collector would roam the woods like it had when it had first been formed, and there wasn't a thing that we could do to stop it. We had no net, no trap, and no amount of intent or desire could trap it as it was now. We were done, but Grandpa wasn't quite ready to throw in the towel just yet. He stepped in front of me, his brave display lessened some as he began to shake with fear. "Run! Run away, kid! Get out of here and live to fight another day. You can lure him to the stream and finish the spell yourself." I gawked at him, not believing what I was hearing. "Gramps, I don't even know how to do the warding, let alone the entrapment. You go. I'll stay and distract him." Grandpa responded by rolling his eyes at me. "Son, I'm not sure I could put enough distance between myself and the collector before he steamrolled me. You can make it, though. Your legs are young, and you can—" But our argument ended as something crashed into the side of the bone collector's head. It turned its horsey skull in the direction it had come from, just in time to catch another one in the eye socket. The arrow rolled around like a carnival beanbag before falling to the forest floor. As Glimmer stepped out of the woods, her face was set in determination.
What are you waiting for? Get going. I will be your distraction.
She fired another arrow at it, and when the bolt stuck into its bony nose hole, it seemed to make up its mind. It went after Glimmer with a loud snarl of rage and a grinding shuffle across the ground. I watched it go, the trees snapping as it pushed through them, and I didn't even notice I was in the world until Grandpa slapped me across the back. "Let's not waste what she's given us. Let's go. Double time." We set off towards the woods again, the sun already a blazing line behind the trees as we hurried for the river. We had to get there before sunset, and there was still a ways to go. The forest was so quiet as we ran, the animals still taking shelter as they hid from the bone collector. Grandpa and I put on a burst of speed, running like rabbits as we heard the brook babbling up ahead of us. As we broke through the tree line, we found the same stream that had saved me after the bottle tree had spread its curse in me. It was wide, 10 feet from bank to bank, but the water was much less fierce today. The snow melt was minimal, and I was glad we wouldn't have to set up in the flowing rip current. Grandpa shrugged out of his bag and started taking things out frantically. "Come on, kid, we gotta get started." I slid my own bag off, and Grandpa walked me through what we needed to do. Chalk, candles, blue and red herbs, kitchen matches, a large bag of graveyard soil. Last but not least, Grandpa pulled out 2 jars of thick red liquid. The way it moved in the jar made me think it wasn't paint. "Take this and make a circle. It won't be perfect, but it'll do the trick," he said, handing me one of those chalk spreading things you see at baseball games. "I'll start setting up the candles and getting the sacrifice ready." "Sacrifice?" I asked, bristling a little at the thought of Grandpa giving this thing something substantial. Grandpa took the jar of blood and held up the bag of grave soil. "The blood and the soil will be too much for it to resist. When he smells it, he'll come on the run. Set that circle up and let's get going." Before I could question any further, Grandpa pulled the last thing out of his bag I would have ever expected. It was an empty bucket of chicken bones from Kentucky Fried Chicken, the remains of our dinner from a few nights ago, back when things had still been normal. I dumped the chalk into the bucket and began to paint the circle we'd need to trap him. It would be broken by the water, but Grandpa assured me that that wouldn't be a problem. We weren't trying to keep it out. We were just trying to get it into the circle so we could trap it there. If we did everything right, it would be stuck in the mud and have no way out once it was in. The sun was little more than an insinuation by the time we were done, and as Grandpa dumped both the blood and the grave soil into the dented old bucket, we both sat on the bank and waited for the bone collector. "So," I asked, needing to hear the end, "what saved you last time?" Grandpa watched the sun sink lower on the horizon, and I wasn't sure he was going to answer, when he finally shook his head and laughed. "The last person I would have ever expected. As I stood there and expected to be shredded by those bony legs, I heard something like a herd of rattlesnakes as their tails shook in unison. Someone came up behind me, his boots sounding hollow on the gravel top, and I turned to see someone I never expected to see again. When I told you that I never saw the snake handler after that day in the old woman's house, that was a lie. I didn't see him for long, but I did see him again. He came walking through the quarry, the hissing, rattling bag slung over his shoulder, and when he tossed it down, the snakes inside went absolutely wild." There was a sound out in the woods. Was it a falling tree? Or was it our quarry? "He looked at me, not entirely without sympathy, and said, 'You look like you could use some help. Let me give you a hand, little buddy.' He reached into the bag and drew out a writhing snake as long as my arm. It spit and squirmed, trying to sink its fangs into him as he held it towards the bone collector. When the snake began to glow, I realized what he meant to do. His prayers were loud and rambly, filled with the guttural language so loved by God. When he began to draw the spirits from the collector, I was in awe. The bone collector is, like most constructs, powered by spirits. The vengeful spirits of the natives whose graves were desecrated, the spirits of angry warriors, the souls of those lost in the needless pursuit of land. He drew them out, the creature turning too slow as its life force was drained by the collected serpents. He dropped each to the ground when he was done, dashing their skulls underfoot as he finished with them. The creature tried to lumber around me to get to him, but my circle had blocked him in. He rammed up against it, seeing the limits and testing the boundaries of my little circle. Soon the ground was wet with the blood of those snakes, and the bone collector was beginning to slow. The souls he had access to were beginning to dwindle, and when the snake handler called to me, I realized his intent. "Now," he yelled, "you can get him now. Trap him and be done with it." So I finished my ward and trapped him right there. He sank into the ground as though the gravel pit had melted. He roared and thrashed, but the gravel accepted him gratefully. He was drugged down into the earth, where he remained until they had to mess with things better left alone. We sat and listened as Grandpa gathered his thoughts, the snapping of trees and the roar of parted earth growing closer. Sounds to me like you're the one that sealed him away. Why did you say it wasn't you? That thing would have had me dead to rights if it hadn't been for the snake-handling man. He weakened it so I could seal it away. Otherwise, I'd have surely died. The collector would have chewed me up and spit me out if it hadn't been for him. It showed me how much I still had to learn and how much growing I still needed to do. Don't we all, I said, standing up as the crashing got closer, and the trees parted violently. Let's hope not, Grandpa said, beginning his chant as the bone collector broke the tree line. The bone collector was now riddled with the remains of arrows. Glimmer had really given it to him. He looked like a porcupine as he broke cover. His bony nose sniffed the air, smelling the grave soil and the blood and the old bones there, and making a beeline for it. Whether he knew we were there at all, I never knew, but as Grandpa's circle started to glow, the candle flames towering, and the air practically crackled with latent power. As the bone collector came fully into the trap, I took a step back as the mud began to grab at the massive creature. The clay around the banks had become thick tendrils, the ends sprouting hands that grabbed at the thrashing creature. He bucked as he felt them grip him, trying to break their hold as they threatened to pull it into the river. They broke apart, but they seemed to redouble with each broken length. Each savage pull took him closer and closer to Grandpa, and my blood ran cold as the old man began to shake. What would happen if the bone collector got him? I'd have no chance if something happened to Grandpa. Was this the same realization he'd come to in the gravel pit? Was it my turn to grow from this experience? You can't do it on your own, said a slimy voice, its tendrils as wet as the clay that now fought the collector. He's just an old man. He doesn't have the strength to pull it off. On the other hand, you could help him, if only you had the power. As the voice spoke, it was like I could feel claws digging into my shoulder. The smell was rotten meat, decaying soil, and I knew who was speaking without seeing him. His slimy words were designed to trap me as readily as the mud would trap the bone collector, but he was also right. I could see the muddy hands beginning to lose ground, the bone collector making his way closer with each step. He'd get him at this rate. He'd get him, and then he'd get me. I could give you some of my power and help you unlock your full potential, but I'll need something in return. His voice was overpowering, just like his odor, and the longer he spoke, the more sense he started to make. Don't listen to him. Grandpa's voice cracked across the voice of the Weldergeist, and I felt his influence shrivel as he wafted away. He's right, though. You can help me, boy. Come stand with me. Chant my words and lend me your strength. You have power, more power than you know, and now is the time to use it. Come stand with me. Lend it to me, and we'll get rid of this bugaboo and go home. My steps were shaky as I moved into the warm embrace of his circle. The air around him crackled, the circles vibrating through the soles of my feet, and when I put my hands on his shoulder, it felt like someone was slowly taking the air out of my lungs. I chanted with him, despite my lack of air, and as our spell built, the hands began to drag the bone collector into the red clay of the Georgia riverbank. It fought, that bony head thrashing as it tried to pull itself free from the clutching hands. The ground bubbled, and the mud frothed, and slowly but surely, the ground accepted its grisly prize. When it was all over, the two of us slumped, the mud churned and broken, like ground with jagged roots just beneath it. You did it, I breathed, looking over at Grandpa as his bird chest went up and down. We did it, Grandpa corrected, taking my hand and gripping it. I couldn't have done it without you, boy. I'd have been lost again without your help. This is our victory, kid. You and I made this happen. Never doubt it. We were still panting and clutching hands when I heard the rhythmic slapping of bare feet coming up the riverbank. Glimmer smiled when she saw us, pulling us both into a hug as she cried in joy.
You did it, Fisher! You and... Hunter. Hunter and Fisher.
I laughed. No hunter by the most generous sense of the word, but Grandpa elbowed me before I could argue with her. Grandma always used to say that if one of the Moon children gives a person a name, it's a great honor. Wear it with pride, Hunter. As we sat on the bank, Glimmer laughing at our mud and sweat-covered looks of astonished gratitude, I found I did feel honored. I almost expected I would see him again tonight. I looked at Grandpa, Glimmer's hand very warm in mine as we walked back to the house. Grandpa had noticed, but if he felt anything about it, he didn't voice it. Glimmer, for her part, had explained that she simply didn't want me getting lost, so she thought she might help me get back home. After the night I'd had, I was glad for the steadying throb it made in my chest when my heart beat. Who? I asked, keeping pace with Grandpa as we walked. The snake handler. I thought he might show up when I needed him again. Silly, huh? He'd be even older than I am, a shriveled mummy of a man. I considered asking him why the Weldergeist had showed up, but realized that I didn't need to. We had been at our most vulnerable, our most willing to make a deal, and maybe he had known that. Grandpa didn't need to think about his old benefactor any more than he had to today. He was still bouncing from his victory over the old foe, and I was still flying high as Glimmer's soft skin pressed against my sweaty hand. We could think about that later. Today, we were victorious, and that was all that mattered. What did you do after he helped you defeat the Bone Collector the first time? Grandpa laughed, and it was good to hear him chuckle. Our day had been filled with uncertainty, and the last 2 days had felt like a lifetime. We had lived under the shadow of that hulking beast, and now we were coming back into the sun again, so to speak. As the canopy of stars opened up above us, I sighed in relief as I let the sounds of the Appalachian mountains by night waft over me. I collapsed after I had finished with my warden. My energy was all but gone. The snake handler came to check on me after checking that his bag was closed, and as he loomed over me, I wasn't sure if he was gonna kill me or help me up. He was a rough customer, but I guess he was more rugged than rough looking back. He helped me up and asked if I was okay and told me I was lucky to be alive. I asked if he was the one who had helped my grandmother and I all those years ago, and he said that it had been him. He was sorry to hear about my grandma, but he was glad to see that I was keeping the family business alive. He told me next time to know my limits before taking on something like that. He claimed he had just been passing by at the right time, but I think he might have been waiting for the Bone Collector or something like it. He knew he would be needed, and he stayed close all those years so he could help when the time was right. That's always stuck with me, and I knew then that I had some growing to do. When I got home and found my draft orders from the government, I knew that this was the chance I had been waiting for. I returned from war a much better man, and I strove to learn as much as possible so I would never need to lean on anyone again like that. Glimmer squeezed my hand, giggling a little but keeping silent as we walked towards the house. It was clear that this hadn't been the last time Grandpa had leaned on someone, but Glimmer was okay with letting him have his moment. The house was much the same as we had left it, but the front porch looked like a tree had fallen on it. The roof had fallen in, and the left wall was a mass of splintered wood. The whole thing had spilled into the yard, and it was a sad sight at the end of such a long day. Grandpa's house had always seemed like a rock in the middle of an ocean of uncertainty. I had never thought that it too might be damaged in our struggles. Grandpa put a hand on the wall, stroking the wood as if it were a loved one he'd had to watch suffer. He didn't cry, but the look of abject sadness that stretched his face was awful to see. How many nights had we sat out here and drank as we listened to the crickets or listened to one of Grandpa's stories? How many stories had I heard from the chairs that were now laying beneath so much rubble? Glimmer and I watched him as he mourned until I just couldn't take it anymore. "We'll fix it up, Gramps." He turned to look at me as though he hadn't quite understood what I'd said. "We can fix it. We can rebuild the porch. It'll be good as new. We can start tomorrow. Hell, we can start tonight if you want. It'll be okay, Gramps. Grandpa looked at me for a few seconds, his agony splitting into a smile that made him wrinkle his face and almost made him look normal again. He nodded, his eyes shining in the moonlight. Sure, kid. We can make it better than it was before if we want. Since this is your house too now, you can put your own mark on it. We started making plans that very night, Glimmer staying until well past midnight. When it was time to leave, she let me walk her out this time. I wasn't too long, but we definitely took a few minutes for ourselves, and I promised I'd meet her the next night for a late-night stroll. When I returned, I found Grandpa asleep on the couch, the mug of cocoa he'd had almost spilling on the floor. I picked him up and put him to bed. We could start on the porch tomorrow. It took us 4 weeks, but it was ready just in time for Halloween. Grandpa and I built, sanded, painted, and put the finishing touches on it before the first trick-or-treaters ever wandered up. Glimmer came to help sometimes, mostly just showing up at sunset to spend time with Grandpa and I. We had taken several walks after sunset, and though she still called me Hunter, she often used my real name when we were together. As Grandpa sat on the porch and handed out candy to smiling superheroes and laughing princesses, he had the biggest smile I'd ever seen him wear. Grandpa was in his element, and there was no question whether he liked the addition to the house. This reminds me of a Halloween after I'd come back from war. I was sitting out here handing out candy when I looked up to see a little boy in a ghost costume. He was shaking his bag at me, silent as the grave, as he begged for sweets. But I was really focused on my bottle tree and how it was shivering. I looked around for the boy's parents, but he was alone. That wasn't uncommon. Lots of parents let their kids roam around during Halloween. The difference in this kid was the blood that I saw drying on the hem of his costume. Some of the kids had stopped to listen to his story, but they all jumped when a voice from behind them gave Grandpa pause.
Are you telling the story about the little ghost boy again?
Glimmer stepped out of the woods, her silver hair in a long braid and her dress a silvery sparkle of moonlight as she came to sit beside me on the porch. She looked otherworldly as she sparkled there. What a costume, one of the mothers said. I'd love to know where you got it from. As Glimmer explained how she had made it herself, I reflected upon my year with Grandpa. As Glimmer laid her head against my shoulder, I wondered what sort of surprises next year would bring with them, and what sort of adventures Grandpa might find to get us into this time. Who knew how much more I might discover by next Halloween?